and welcome. You're watching BloombergQuint here in Davos at the World Economic Forum's annual summit. I have with me Ken Rogoff, Professor for Economics at Harvard University. Professor Rogoff, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Always a pleasure.
How has your Davos been so far? What's been the highlight?
Well, I guess it wasn't having to wait for an hour locked in a bus stop because President Trump's had all his cars blocking the road and we had to wait. But it's been very interesting. I've learned a lot of interesting things, a lot of interesting thoughts.
What did you make of President Trump's speech?
Well, it was surprisingly disciplined. I mean, he's someone who usually goes off script, looks for applause lines. I think he knew he might not get applause here. He might have gotten a pregnant pause, but not applause. He might have gotten booed. So it's very disciplined. One of the most disciplined speeches he's given, you know, in his entire presidency. The material wasn't new, but there were probably a lot more numbers in it. Maybe 3/4 of them were true.
3/4 of them were true. So I must, expand the conversation to your outlook for not just American growth, which seems to, the outlook seems to be that it will moderate this year, the uncertainties that the election will bring, but also global growth and some of the endemic issues we're facing. For instance, everyone I speak to says central banks have pretty much exhausted all the ammunition they have, and that, even fiscal interventions in some ways have partly run their course, and in other countries they just don't have the space with regards to their deficit to do anything. And so therefore we should be prepared for a decade of very slow growth. Is that a broad prognosis you agree with?
Well, I mean, there's sort of two separate issues. I think if we have a recession, the tools are limited. You're depending on monetary policy, but it can't do that much. And fiscal policy, let's use a more honest phrase, political intervention, because it's very unpredictable. I think there's some countries like Australia where there's a lot of consensus. They can execute a fiscal policy, might not be perfect timing. In my country, it has different meanings to different people. The Republicans would cut taxes, the Democrats would raise the size of government. As soon as they shift power, they'd undo each other. So the idea that fiscal policy can step in. For slow growth, I'm a little more optimistic. I feel innovation will pick up. I feel we're still seeing the long legs of the financial crisis, so I'm a little more optimistic.
Okay, but we're also set for less globalization, more regionalism, more hyper-nationalism. So where does this end? I mean, how do we decipher what this decade is going to bring? Most of the last decade was spent getting over the global financial crisis. What's going to be new and interesting in this decade?
Well, if we get deglobalization, that is not going to be a good thing. Yeah. President Trump may say it's a good thing, but it's not. And that would not only slow growth, it could reverse some of the growth that we've had. I tend to think that won't happen precisely for that reason, because once politicians realize how damaging it's going to be, they'll pull back. But where the next decade goes, I mean, I do think innovation and productivity, AI, inventions that have happened over the last 15 or 20 years, but particularly because of the financial crisis, the implementation's been very slow. So it's very hard to predict productivity growth, but in particular, just because it was slow last decade is not a strong prediction that it will be next decade.
One of the questions I've been trying to sort of, ask everyone here and look for answers has to do with the wage issue. And while they seem to be rising a little bit in the US, in many parts of the world, wages have stagnated for a very long time. Do you see that continuing over the course of the next few years? And do you see fiscal solutions at all being worked on for that?
I don't see easy solution to this problem, which has to do with technology, globalization, favoring workers who can make use of these things, and workers who can't are losing out. And I think we live in an era where probably government transfers need to be higher in many countries to compensate that. I'm talking particularly about the advanced economies, because I think in a lot of emerging markets, India, China, there's a lot of room for growth still. But in the advanced economies, I don't know. We can talk about education. We can talk about infrastructure. I don't think protectionism is a solution. I don't think unionization is a solution in a globalized world. The reason unions died was because of globalization, technology, competition. So that's a huge challenge. If we don't find a way to face it, the populism will get more extreme, and we're more likely to go into a long-term tailspin, or at least slow growth period.
Okay, you spoke of the possibility, or rather you referenced the possibility of a recession earlier on in your first answer. So let me ask you some country-specific questions. There are some forecasts that the U.S. might face one this year or next, and then there are those who disagree with that. Where do you stand on this?
You know, I found a lot of my colleagues are hoping for a recession this year so that it'll affect the election, but I think the odds are slightly higher. Like in a normal year, there's a chance you'll have a recession, 15, 16%. Maybe this year it's 20 or 25%. And the odds of having a really deep recession, I think, are a lot lower than that, certainly in the U.S. I mean, in Europe also, their baseline is lower. So I don't know what you call a recession in Europe because 1% growth is normal. So if they go to minus 0.5%, that's a pretty small dip. I worry most about China because they're clearly on a slowing trajectory. Long run growth in China is going to be much lower than it is today. The population's slowing. They have a horrible demography problem. Their catch up with the West has slowed down. They've overbuilt in housing, which is their stimulus, on and on. And they're very good at dealing with problems. It's much easier to deal with a growing economy than a slowing economy. So, and another area I would highlight of being at risk are emerging markets in general, where there's really been quite an explosion of debt. Admittedly, a lot of it's private debt, but in these many countries where there are monopoly corporations, there aren't many companies, the distinction between government and private and government's not clear. So debt is going like this, growth is going like this, and it's, I think, a fragile situation. The World Bank did a report recently that called attention to that.
Would India figure on your list of countries that you're concerned about, where we've had issues in the financial system, credit issues, higher debt, a lot of cleaning up in terms of corporate balance sheets, lots more to go, and growth that's slowing?
Well, I defer to my colleague Peter Kenneth, who's now head of the IMF, and their forecast, which basically says the most likely is things will get a bit better, that there were reasons growth slowed down, ranging from the aftermath of demonetization to, maybe more importantly, bumps in introducing the GST that will go away over time. The banking sector is certainly still a problem, but I think India, I'm probably more optimistic about than maybe many other emerging markets.
So I was speaking with Professor Fan Gang yesterday, and he said that China will continue to grow at in and around 6%, according to his assessment, for the better part of this decade. If India's growth doesn't move substantially higher than 6.5%, 7%, we're looking at two large economies from a population point of view growing at sub-7, sub-8% growth. What does that mean for global growth this decade? Not that India was a driver of growth at all, but if the U.S. is moderating for the next few years...
Well, I think India has the potential to grow at 7 and 8% for a long time. China does not. India has a young population. It has a lot of potential to deepen its infrastructure to catch up. China is at the other end of the curve. They're reaching the end of the line. And yes, Fang is very good, but they can't say anything different because that's what the leader says. I think everyone recognizes that the future growth over the next decade in China is probably 3%, 4%, the average over the next decade. Well, because they don't have population growth anymore. Their labor force is shrinking. They're much further along the technological catch-up curve, and they have overbuilt housing, very centralized government. So I think China probably is not going to be contributing as much. But as India grows, it will contribute more and more. I mean, I think there's plenty of reasons to be optimistic that India can do better than 6%.
Well, we've always had plenty of reason to be optimistic. We just haven't been able to deliver on that optimism. Do you see the economic policies of this current government being able to deliver 8% growth?
Well, I think actually it's not all dependent on economic policy. There are cycles.
Okay.
I have to say, some of my Indian colleagues are skeptical, but I think the fundamentals with the very young population, the fast-growing cities, probably bodes well for India to be the fastest growing country the next 5 years of the large countries. I hope so anyway.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Professor Rogoff.
Thank
and
you.
Thanks for speaking to us here at BloombergQuint.
Pleasure.
Thank you.